So I wanted to give you all my sort of final thoughts on the Rogue after playing around with it at level 100, testing all the different builds I've been showcasing. And I say final in quotations because I'll definitely be returning to the Rogue and adapting and improving, but I do want to try out every class and get them all to level 100, and so that's going to be my next goals. I've already gotten the Necromancer up and ready to go in terms of some builds, and that content will be coming soon. But in order for you all to kind of see what the end game is going to be like, keep in mind that when I consider end game, I think tier 40, tier 45, Nightmare Dungeons plus. That's what we're going to be showcasing. And, well, the Rogue is extremely good early game. And for farming, it's going to be arguably one of the best, if not the best. This is something that a lot of people already know. If you've played the early game on the Rogue, which everyone has if you're playing a Rogue, then you already know how good they can be. It's really about whether or not you can kind of hold your own in the late game and whether or not the criticism of the Rogue, which they're too squishy, is true. And I'll just say right up front, that is a big concern oftentimes with the Rogue, is being able to get off your damage. Now, I'm showing you a tier 53, and I'll start off with the pros of the Rogue here. The pro, first off, is that with melee builds, you are extremely quick. If you're playing a ranged build, you're going to find that it's oftentimes a lot slower to get through some of the farming parts from at least the general expectation of the dungeons. There are some scenarios where you could find that rapid fire or penetrating shot can outperform a melee build in some scenarios, but generally speaking, the melee builds are going to be just slightly better in terms of speed farming and being able to compete at these tier up to, I want to say, tier 65 Nightmare Dungeons, okay? And that's what you're mainly going to be doing for, I guess you say, end game gear grinding, is farming that. And it does extremely well. And you're very quick, you have a ton of damage, and you just scoot through everything. But you'll notice there, and I wanted to keep every sort of, I guess you'd say, con or the realistic examples that you're going to see. You need to stay in the fight, and without staying in the fight, you're going to lose things like being able to heal off of your close enemies. You're going to lose things like your armor stacking. You're going to lose things like your damage reduction off your basic, because a lot of things will force you to stay in the fight in order for you to stay alive, and that's honestly typical for a lot of classes, but in particular the melee rogue. If you're going to play a ranged rogue, the playstyle completely changes, and you're going to find that you kind of have to make sure you're avoiding a lot of things rather than kind of getting into the fight, which tends to make it a little bit slower, especially for the later dungeons. But you can see the damage here is very good, and you have no problems whatsoever farming Nightmare Dungeons. And here's where we start to talk about where the problems come in for the Rogue. As you can see here, this is a tier 65, and this affix was actually pretty bad, but I just wanted to show it for you all. This one has the 60% reduction in poison damage, and I am running a poison imbuement build at the current moment, so my damage is not as good as I wanted it to be. But you'll notice I already died twice in this dungeon, and that is because, well, this is a bad roll, for me at least. There's a lot of phantom archers, as you'll see here, and phantom archers are pretty rough to deal with, okay? But also on top of that whole thing is that you'll get to a point in some of these dungeons where you actually just take so much damage to where the point you kind of get one shot. Now, there are a few things I'd like to change and perhaps run a different build for, but the point still stands in which the Rogue does start to fall off quite a bit. And I do want to mention, I do not have a min-max build. In fact, I would like to change up some of my gear. I would like to, upgrade my glyphs to 21, which they're not at 21, they're mostly at 15. And so there are some improvements I can make. It definitely min-max out character. But I think for most people, you're going to find that this tends to be the case, at least for playing the farming situations at tier 65 or so, or below. You're going to find that it's quick. And then as soon as you hit tier 65 or tier 66, tier 67, you're going to find that you end up getting one shot quite significantly all the time. It's just what's going to happen. And that's where you have to start transitioning to another version of the Rogue, because what you'll notice here at a tier 78, you just cannot survive, you know. This first one I just ran in here just to see what it was like a little while back, and you can see I literally just got one shot by a common mob. And so I was like, okay, if we're getting one shot by common mobs, then I'm gonna have to pre-fire my basic to try to build up some armor, to try to build up the damage reduction. I need to play a lot more carefully. The problem still is that I am a melee character, right? If you're playing the melee rogue. And if you're playing a melee rogue, well, you have to get into the fight to some degree and at least hit a couple times with your twisting blades. And I figured, you know what, we're just going to try to jump in and try to fight it off with, you know, some armor stacking and some of the melee viability that you have with the healing, etc. And it just doesn't work super well. And so what I ended up finding out about the endgame rogue is that the melee builds are significantly less viable. They are absolutely insane and way better than the ranged builds up until they're not good at all. And that's what ends up happening with some of these later tier nightmare dungeons, is that you really can't, unless perhaps you have a way more min-max build than I, but because we are sitting here diving into the battle, you're going to find that it's very difficult to stay alive at all. And that's why you have to play from range and try to snipe out people. And here at 73, I wanted to showcase what this kind of looks like. This is doable as a melee build, but it's still pretty rough. And something that I would probably just prefer to run a range build. And as I said, I'm not able to push tier 70, tier 80 nightmare dungeons with the range build, simply for the fact that, well, I don't have a min-maxed range build. You do need to swap all your gear over. You do need to level up entirely separate glyphs. And although I'm able to do tier 60s pretty easily, well, I don't care about doing tier 60s because I could do tier 60s faster with the melee build, right? So that's the point where you kind of need to change your mentality about the rogue completely and run in with the range build, play as sort of that sniper. And you're gonna have to completely reformat your direction, which kind of sucks to some degree because it is a lot of effort to try to revamp your gear. You know, even swapping out paragon points and skill points can be a little bit annoying and expensive. And so that's where you kind of, if you wish to push higher tier nightmare dungeons, well, you're probably going to want to focus on some sort of range build. My preferred one would be the penetrating shot one, but you can run rapid fire as it's kind of solid as well. And you could do things like stacking the Dark Shroud and just kind of stacking a ton of the damage reduction options that Rogue has. But the odd thing about the damage reduction options that Rogue has is that they're oftentimes sort of like one and done, meaning if you get hit once, the damage reduction gets reduced, specifically in consideration of Dark Shroud, right? And so if that's the case, well, playing a ranged rogue ends up benefiting you more than just not being able to be hit. It actually gives you more value out of your Dark Shroud because you're not forcibly getting hit by so many different monsters, okay? So it's not just, oh, I'm melee, so I'm gonna get hit by all these melee characters. It's, I'm able to keep up the things that make me tankier more often because I don't have to get hit at all. And that's where the big thing with the rogue comes in, which is that you have to transition to a way more slower playstyle. And if you compare it to the druid or barbarian later on in the game, I've seen a lot of clips of, you know, the werewolf druid just absolutely annihilate these late game dungeons, which is kind of the reason why I've constantly been rating the rogue kind of that lower A/B tier compared to the druid. And in fact, initially I had rated the barb way higher than the rogue, and I think that honestly the rogue might even be rated a little bit lower than I previously had thought. I could see the sorcerer and necro being very similar in their viability later on, simply for the fact that I don't think any of these three classes can really compete with the druid or the barbarian, which is kind of interesting. So I found that a little bit more interesting, and you know, maybe there are a lot more options when you start to get that really min-maxed range build. But as far as, you know, what your average player is going to play, you're not even going to get to this point. And in fact, even more so than that, even if you're semi-casual and you do get to 100, min-maxing a build and swapping up your build is probably never going to happen. So just expect, you know, when you do reach this point in terms of endgame viability, that the rogue is going to drop off pretty hard, and getting to that tier 100 clear is going to be pretty rough. I will note that the damage coming out from the rogue is arguably one of the strongest, but the survivability is the problem with farming these late game nightmare dungeons. If you want to dive into an uber pinnacle boss fight with Lilith, then Rogue is going to be a great option. But if you're looking to clear out some of these late game nightmare dungeons, then, well, Rogue is going to really struggle. So hopefully that gives you guys a good idea on what the Rogue is going to be like as you get to this point. And, well, it can be pretty brutal sometimes, and I think that if you're really looking to push tier 100s, then you probably want to go with the Druid, I'd say, is probably the best option from what I've seen, but Barbarian's still very good at pushing those late game nightmare dungeons. Thanks for watching. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below, and I'll see you all for the next one.